was to dog the lighter and more mobile Panther, which entered service from 1943. The earlier German Mark III and IV tanks were now no match for the T-34. The German military logistics system, its Achilles heel, much of it being still horse-drawn, was under extreme strain, operating over extended distances on primitive roads that readily broke up, turning into deeply rutted quagmires in the thaw. These roads and the rickety rail system in the USSR were also under constant risk of attack from partisan forces operating deep in the German rear areas. The Russian pressure was maintained on all sectors of the huge Eastern Front. In January 1944, Leningrad was finally relieved, a great psychological as well as military triumph for Moscow. There was to be no let-up. In the face of remorseless pressure, the whole of the German Army Group North fell back along the Baltic coast. Hitler, alarmed by the turn of events and desperate to keep a hold on the Baltic, training ground for the new generation of U-boats and their crews, sacked and replaced the Northern Army Group's commander, General Kuchler. His successor, Field Marshal Walter Model, had begun his campaigning in Russia in 1941 as a divisional commander, but had gained accelerated promotion through personal bravery, professional competence, and loyalty to his Führer. Although he had experienced serious reverses, notably at Kursk in 1943, his reputation as the Führer's fireman and shield and sword still held good, and he enjoyed the confidence of the troops under his command. Thanks to his efforts, the Soviet advance was stemmed, at least temporarily, on the Polish border, giving time for the Germans to regroup. At the same time, in the south, the Russian 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts broke out across the river Dnieper to savage Manstein's Army Group South. Further south, with its right flank on the Black Sea, Kleist's Army Group A was assailed by the 2nd, 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts, under the formidable marshals Konev, Malinovsky and Tolbukin. Odessa fell on the 10th of April 1944. The Russians were now ready to cross into Poland and were already deep into Romania. The last Germans were ejected from the Crimea, and Sevastopol fell on the 12th of May. Field Marshals Manstein and Kleist, who had conducted brilliant fighting withdrawals, were sacked in March 1944 for their pains by an infuriated Hitler. In the case of Erich von Manstein, Hitler made a potentially fatal error. The Germans now reorganized their forces in the southern fronts into Army Groups North and South Ukraine, under the respective commands of Field Marshals Mödel and Schorner, both regarded as safe Nazi apostles. Neither, however, was in the class of Manstein, whose ability amounted to genius, as with depleted forces he had fought the road back from Stalingrad, inflicting devastating losses on his numerically superior but professionally inferior opponents. Hitler's obsession over not yielding ground had now cost his country dear. Instead of using the spring of 1944 to disengage from the Russians and fall well back to a shorter prepared defensive line, buying time whilst his array of war-winning secret weaponry came online, he persisted in issuing directives denying his able generals the chance to use their superior tactical skills. The new weapons on which Hitler now placed his faith were indeed formidable, at least on paper. The V-1 pilotless aircraft, V-2 ballistic rocket, jet fighter aircraft, and a new generation of fast U-boats would have created immense problems for the Allies had they entered service in quantity in 1944. As it was, delays caused by Hitler's personal intervention in their design and deployment proved fatal for Germany. One example is that of the Messerschmitt 262, the first operational jet fighter in the world. An outstanding potential interceptor, vastly superior in speed to the American P-51 Mustang, it offered a last-minute reprieve in the air defense of Germany. But Hitler's insistence that it be redesigned for the light bomber role led to many months of delay in its entry into service. Once launched at the American bomber formations, it performed sensationally in the hands of aces such as Colonel Galland, who, describing the new sensation of flying with jet propulsion, felt it was as though angels were pushing. Galland, who was one of the outstanding fighter pilots of all time, and subsequently staunch friend of many against whom he had flown, flew the Me-262 successfully against the American bombers. But it was too late. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe's fuel supplies were virtually exhausted, and even though the jets could fly on inferior fuel, similar to diesel, there was a dearth of even that. In any case, the short range and endurance of the Me-262 rendered it useless for support of the army above the battlefield. And in this respect, the Soviets had long held the upper hand. The summer of 1944 saw no easing of the Red Army's pressure. On the 6th of June, the British and Americans had landed in Normandy, drawing further Wehrmacht resources westwards. The 1,200-mile frontage in the east was now held by dangerously thinned-out forces, and at the end of June, the Russians resumed the offensive. Hitler continued to ignore the generals who advised a retirement that would enable the Germans to hold a shorter and stronger line. General Busch of Army Group Center faced the assault of no less than 3 Soviet fronts, under command of the Soviet Deputy Supreme Commander Marshal Zhukov, on a frontage of some 350 miles. In order to achieve overwhelming firepower at the main points of attack, the Russians had massed a staggering 400 guns per mile of front. Behind the German forward positions, thousands of guerrillas attacked administrative units, headquarters and airfields. Not all of these were fighting for Stalin and communism. There were numerous bands of dissident Russians, Ukrainians, Red Army deserters, and Cossacks who had initially greeted the Germans' invasion of 1941 as a liberation, but who had rapidly become disillusioned by the conqueror's savage treatment of the civil population. To one such band of guerrillas fell the Soviet Marshal Vatutin, mortally wounded in an ambush when in command of the 1st Ukrainian Front. The Luftwaffe, now short of aircraft, trained aircrew and aviation fuel, was shot out of the sky by overwhelming numbers of Russian fighter aircraft. Advancing Red Army troops were closely supported by masses of fighter bombers, operating as flying artillery to overwhelm any points of resistance. The Ilyushin IL-2, known as the Stormovik, was one of the most significant warplanes to emerge in World War II. Heavily armoured against ground fire and with a 2-man crew, it could carry a formidable warload of cannon, rockets and bombs. Almost 25,000 of them were built, and by sheer weight of numbers, they swamped the German ground forces when unleashed against them. Formerly, the Luftwaffe had enjoyed air superiority, destroying hundreds of Stormoviks. The tables had been turned. Earlier in the campaign, Junkers 87 Stuka dive bombers, fitted with powerful cannon, had wrought great execution on Soviet tanks by attacking their vulnerable upper surface armour with cannon fire. But the cumbersome Stukas needed conditions of air superiority and plentiful fighter cover in which to operate. Lacking the close protection of their escorting fighters, they vanished from above the troops who had relied on their support.